5,000 roentgens. That's the dose the men who entered K-19's reactor compartment absorbed. The lethal threshold, the point at which half of all exposed people die without treatment, is 450 roentgens. These men received more than 10 times that figure. They knew roughly what they were walking into. They went anyway, and the Soviet Navy buried the medical records for 27 years. K-19 wasn't just a submarine, she was a political object. By 1958, the United States had Polaris missiles at sea, submarine-launched ballistic missiles that Moscow couldn't track and couldn't intercept. Khrushchev needed an answer, fast. The order went to shipyard number 402 in Severodvinsk. Build a nuclear-armed ballistic missile submarine, and build it now. The schedule was compressed, corners were cut. During fitting out, a fire broke out in the reactor compartment. Workers died. The welds throughout the boat were later found to be defective. She hadn't left the dock, and her own crew was already calling her Hiroshima. She was commissioned into the Soviet Northern Fleet in November 1960. Engineering officers flagged persistent defects in the reactor coolant system. The complaints were noted, the production pressure was greater. She sailed anyway. By July 1961, K-19 was on her first operational patrol, North Atlantic, near Jan Mayen Island off the Norwegian coast. She was shadowing NATO exercises and carrying 3 nuclear-armed R-13 ballistic missiles and a nuclear torpedo. At 04:15 on the morning of 4th of July, a pressure gauge in the primary coolant loop of the starboard reactor dropped to 0. A reactor coolant failure is not an abstract problem. The coolant carries heat away from the fuel rods. Without it, temperature climbs. The fuel rods degrade. Then the reactor vessel itself is at risk. On a submarine in the middle of the North Atlantic, carrying nuclear weapons, that's not a fire you contain. It ends with the hull on the bottom, or worse, a detonation that contaminates an ocean. K-19 had no backup cooling system. The Soviet Navy had not installed one, despite knowing the design had vulnerabilities. Captain First Rank Nikolai Zateyev had exactly one option: fabricate an emergency cooling bypass from scratch inside the reactor compartment while the reactor was running. He needed men who could weld, men who could work in conditions that would kill them. Lieutenant Boris Korchilov was the chief engineering officer. He understood reactors, he understood dose, he led the first shift. With him went Seaman Yuri Ordochkin, Seaman Semyon Penkov, Seaman Valery Karitonov, and others, 8 men in total, across multiple shifts. What they were given to protect themselves: rubber sheeting cut from other equipment, fashioned into improvised suits, cotton surgical masks, standard naval work gloves, no lead shielding, no dosimetry rated for those radiation levels. The dosimeters they carried had a maximum reading. The actual levels inside that compartment exceeded it. In real time, no one knew the exact dose. They only knew it was off the scale. Korchilov's exchange with Zateyev before he entered is recorded in the captain's memoir. He understood what was waiting on the other side of that hatch. He went in. The work took approximately 2 hours across multiple shifts. The men cut pipe. They welded a bypass cooling line from whatever materials were aboard. The heat inside the compartment was punishing on its own. The radiation was invisible. You couldn't feel a Röntgen. You felt the nausea afterward. The line held. Reactor temperature began to fall. K-19 surfaced. Within hours, the first symptoms appeared: nausea, vomiting, skin that looked burned, though no flame had touched it, hair coming loose. The ship's medical officer had no treatment protocol for acute radiation syndrome at these dose levels. He could observe and document, not much else. A Soviet diesel submarine arrived days later and took off the most critically ill. The transfer was done at sea. By 26 July 1961, 22 days after the repair, all 8 men who had entered the reactor compartment were dead. Korchilov was among the first. The others followed in sequence as acute radiation syndrome progressed: bone marrow failure, immune collapse, organ shutdown. They were buried in closed coffins. Their families were told there had been a naval accident, no further details. Over the following 2 years, 15 more K-19 crew members died of radiation-related illness. The doses they'd absorbed during the incident caught up with them more slowly. Zateyev filed a detailed after-action report. He documented the coolant failure, the improvised repair, the crew exposures, the deaths, the absent backup cooling system, the inadequate protective equipment. He named names, he told the truth in writing, and submitted it up the chain. The Soviet Navy classified it at the highest level. Zateyev was debriefed. Pressure was applied. His candor had consequences for his career. The surviving crew went through KGB interviews and came out understanding clearly what they were not to say to anyone, ever. For 27 years, the Soviet Union's official position was that nothing worth discussing had happened on K-19 in July 1961. The boat kept sailing. In 1972, a fire killed 28 more of her crew. By then, she had a second nickname, the Widowmaker. She wasn't decommissioned until 1990. Glasnost cracked the silence open in 1991. Zateyev, finally allowed to speak, began giving interviews. The classified documents surfaced. What they confirmed was exactly what he'd written in 1961. The dosimeters had been pegged at maximum, the actual doses could only be estimated retrospectively, and the men had been sent in with equipment that offered no meaningful protection. In 1994, the Russian government posthumously awarded the 8 reactor workers the Order of Courage. 33 years after they died, their families, who had spent 3 decades believing their sons and husbands died in an unspecified naval accident, now had a name for it. They did not receive substantial compensation. They received a medal. The improvised cooling line, those 8 men welded together in rubber suits and cotton masks, held long enough to prevent a reactor meltdown on a submarine carrying 3 nuclear ballistic missiles in the North Atlantic, at the height of the Cold War. The Soviet Navy's position for nearly 3 decades was that this outcome, the line held, the reactor stabilized, meant the incident didn't need to be discussed. But here's where the story gets structural rather than personal. The dosimeters the men carried had a maximum rated measurement. The radiation in that compartment exceeded it before they finished the first shift. What the Soviet Navy chose not to record was the actual number. What they recorded instead was the maximum the instrument could display, and called that sufficient. If the dosimeter can't measure it, the dose doesn't exist. If the dose doesn't exist, the men weren't harmed. If the men weren't harmed, there's no liability, no obligation to retrofit backup cooling systems across the rest of the fleet, no requirement to issue proper protective equipment to the next crew sent in with a wrench and a welding torch. This is the mechanism that ran beneath every Cold War nuclear program, East and West. Not individual malice, something more structural. The program required the outcome. The outcome required the men. The men required a dose that could be managed on paper. So the paper was managed. K-19 was rushed because Khrushchev needed an answer to Polaris by a date that existed on a political calendar, not an engineering one. The defective welds were accepted. The missing backup cooling system was accepted. Every one of those decisions made 4th of July 1961 more likely. And when it happened, the system's first instinct wasn't to fix the underlying problem, it was to contain the information. The lesson that should have come from Korchilov and his 7 colleagues was classified along with Zateyev's report. What you're left with is a simple arithmetic problem that took 33 years to solve officially. 8 men entered a compartment. They received a dose the instruments couldn't measure. They built something that worked. They were dead within 3 weeks. The thing they built outlasted them by decades. Korchilov went in first. He knew the numbers well enough to understand what they meant. The reactor was running. The compartment was flooding with radiation at a rate no cotton mask was going to slow. He picked up his tools and went in anyway, because a reactor meltdown with 3 ballistic missiles aboard was worse. That calculation was real. He made it correctly. The Soviet Navy's response was to classify the fact that he'd made it at all. The Order of Courage arrived in 1994, posthumous. His family had waited 33 years to be told officially what Boris Korchilov had done on the morning of the 4th July 1961. The medal is a small object. The gap between what it represents and when it arrived tells you more about the Soviet nuclear program than any single document in the declassified archive. The dosimeter pegged at maximum, the report filed and buried, the crew ordered to silence, the boat kept in service. 28 more dead in 1972, decommissioned in 1990, recognized in 1994. That's the documented timeline of what a Soviet nuclear submarine did to the men inside its reactor room.